Let's step back in time for a moment. The air is thick with uncertainty, and the world feels like it's crashing down. Naomi, a woman living in a foreign land, is now left alone. Her husband and both her sons have died. She has no protection, no family to lean on, and no clear path forward. The weight of grief must have been unbearable. Many of us can relate to Naomi, can't we? Life throws us unexpected, heavy burdens, and we wonder, where's God in all of this? Naomi certainly asked the same question. Now imagine Ruth, Naomi's daughter-in-law, a young Moabite widow. She too had lost her husband. Yet instead of wallowing in despair or choosing the easier route, she clung to Naomi. Here's where we see the first lesson in loyalty and faithfulness. Despite Naomi's bitter grief and insistence that Ruth return to her people and start over, Ruth stood firm. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Ruth 1:16. That's not just loyalty, that's faith. Loyalty amid the storm. Loyalty today is often a fragile thing, easily broken in the face of hardship. But Ruth's story teaches us a profound lesson. Loyalty isn't about convenience. It's about faithfulness in the storm. Think about the times when relationships become difficult, when circumstances challenge us to the core. Loyalty doesn't bail out, it digs deeper. Ruth chose loyalty over comfort, even when the future looked bleak. She left behind her homeland, her culture, and her gods to follow Naomi into the unknown. Ruth understood something that many of us need to grasp today. God's faithfulness often shines brightest in the most difficult circumstances. She wasn't just committed to Naomi. She was trusting in Naomi's God, the true God. That's the kind of faith that holds steady when life is falling apart. Faith in uncertainty. Imagine the fear Ruth must have faced as she entered Bethlehem, a foreign woman likely to be marginalized. The weight of being an outsider, with no prospects of remarriage or security, must have been heavy. But here's where God's invisible hand comes in. Ruth didn't know what awaited her in Bethlehem, but she trusted that the God she had come to know through Naomi would provide. And this is where the lesson becomes relevant for us today. How often do we face uncertainty? Maybe it's a broken relationship, a financial crisis, or even just the stress of daily life. We often want clarity before we move forward. But Ruth's story shows us that faith requires stepping out before we see the whole picture. It's in the uncertainty that God meets us. Working in the fields of grace. Ruth, in her humility, didn't sit idle when they arrived in Bethlehem. She worked. She gleaned in the fields, gathering leftover grain to support herself and Naomi. Now let's pause here. Ruth could have seen herself as a victim. She could have thrown in the towel, overcome by the weight of her circumstances. But she didn't. She worked diligently, trusting that her efforts, no matter how small, would be blessed by God. Sometimes when we're in difficult situations, we think the best thing is to wait until everything's clear. Or worse, we wait for someone to rescue us. But Ruth's story teaches us to be active in our faith. Yes, God is faithful, but faith often requires action. She worked in the fields, and God's grace met her there. This is a reminder for us, isn't it? Whether it's in our work, relationships, or personal struggles, God calls us to be diligent. He meets us in the fields of our effort, even when we're simply gathering the leftovers of life. Ruth's humility and hard work led her to meet Boaz, a man who would not only redeem her, but transform her story entirely. The Redeemer's role. Enter Boaz, a man of noble character. He wasn't just a wealthy landowner, he was a kinsman redeemer. In the ancient world, a kinsman redeemer had the responsibility to help family members in dire situations. Boaz recognized Ruth's loyalty, her faith, and her integrity. He saw beyond her being a foreigner or a widow. He saw her heart. Isn't that just like God? He doesn't focus on where we've been or what we've lost. He sees our heart and redeems us despite our past. Boaz went above and beyond what was required. He ensured Ruth's safety and provided abundantly for her and Naomi. When Ruth approached him for redemption, she showed incredible courage. She trusted that Boaz would do the right thing, just as we trust that God, our ultimate Redeemer, will provide for us when we come to him in faith. There's a profound message in Boaz's actions for us today. Redemption is God's heart for his people. Just as Boaz redeemed Ruth, giving her a future and a hope, so God redeems us through Christ. Whatever situation you're in, whether it's the weight of past mistakes, broken relationships, or financial struggles, God offers redemption. He turns our brokenness into beauty. God's faithfulness in relationships. Ruth's story doesn't end with her marriage to Boaz. She became the great-grandmother of King David, and through her lineage came the ultimate Redeemer, Jesus Christ. Who would have thought that a poor foreign widow would be part of the greatest story ever told? But that's God's faithfulness. He uses the unlikely, the overlooked, and the broken to fulfill His purposes. When we look at our relationships, whether family, friendships, or romantic connections, we often see the challenges. But God sees the potential for redemption. He calls us to faithfulness, not just when it's easy, but especially when it's hard. Ruth's loyalty to Naomi was the catalyst for God's redemptive work in her life. It wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was a quiet, steadfast commitment that God honored. In our lives today, we might find ourselves in difficult relationships, strained marriages, challenging friendships, or broken family ties. Ruth's story encourages us to be faithful, even when it's tough, trusting that God is working behind the scenes. Our loyalty, our commitment, and our faith can open the door for God's miraculous work. The quiet faithfulness of God. One of the most remarkable things about the book of Ruth is how God's presence is seen but never directly spoken of. There are no parting seas or burning bushes in this story. Yet God's hand is at work in every chapter, guiding Ruth, providing for her, and weaving her story into His grand plan. Isn't that often how it is in our own lives? We might not always see the big miracles or hear God's voice booming from the heavens, but His quiet faithfulness is always there. In the daily grind, in the mundane moments, God is working. Ruth didn't need to see the end of her story to trust in God's faithfulness, and neither do we. Actionable advice for today. So what does Ruth's story teach us about living faithfully in difficult circumstances? 1. Stay committed. Just as Ruth stayed loyal to Naomi, we are called to be faithful in our relationships and commitments, even when things get hard. Loyalty is a reflection of God's steadfast love for us. 2. Step out in faith. Don't wait for perfect clarity before you move forward. Like Ruth, trust God in the uncertainty. Take that step of faith, knowing He will guide you. 3. Work diligently. Ruth didn't sit back and wait for provision. She worked in the fields. God calls us to put in the effort, trusting that He will bless the work of our hands. 4. Seek redemption. Boaz's role as a redeemer points us to Jesus, our ultimate redeemer. Whatever mess we're in, Jesus offers redemption. We don't have to stay stuck in our past or our mistakes. 5. Trust God's quiet faithfulness. Even when we don't see the big miracles, God is at work. Trust His hand, even in the small details of your life. Final thought. A legacy of faithfulness. Ruth's story is a reminder that faithfulness in difficult relationships and circumstances leads to redemption and restoration. It's not always easy, and it often requires sacrifice and courage. But God is faithful. He sees your loyalty, your faith, and your work, even when it seems unnoticed by others. Just as Ruth's story ended in redemption, so will yours when you trust in God's faithfulness. Call to action. If Ruth's story has inspired you, I encourage you to reflect on your own life. Are there areas where you need to show more loyalty, more faith? Are you willing to step out and trust, even when the future seems unclear? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. Share them in the comments below. Let's continue this journey of faith together. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who might need encouragement today. There's so much more to come. Stay tuned for more stories of God's faithfulness.